Hello, I'm Steve Young and welcome to Toyota Split-Tumbler Locks. This is one of a series of videotapes designed to teach servicing techniques for import car locks to the beginning and experienced locksmith. In this video, you will learn how and why the new Toyota Split-Tumbler locks work. We will cover the four basic types of these locks: door locks, ignition locks, trunk locks, and glove compartment locks. You will see how to remove the lock from the car, disassemble, reassemble, make keys for, and rekey all of these locks. This new lock system was introduced in 1992 exclusively on the Toyota Camry. These locks were intended to be a high security lock system. The tumblers are specifically designed to prevent picking and to prevent impressioning with a key that has been bladed. However, most locksmiths who are familiar with the system agree that the design of the locks will also make them high-maintenance locks. Both the split tumblers and the solid tumblers can be damaged in many ways. Attempting to impression these locks without understanding how the locks are built could easily damage the lock. The most important part of servicing these locks is to understand that this is a delicate lock system and it must be treated gently. As we go along, be prepared to pause or rewind your VCR until you thoroughly understand each technique. Understanding these new locks inside and out is vital to any locksmith who plans to service this new lock system. Let's begin by learning how to unlock the 1992 Camry if the keys have been lost or are locked inside the car. There are two ways of opening the 1992 Toyota Camry, one through the front door and one through the back door. The back door method is extremely easy, so easy in fact that Toyota will probably take steps to stop it in the near future. However, in the meantime, you can open these cars through the rear door with a fondue fork, sometimes called a pickle fork. This tool is inserted under the handle to manipulate the linkage. Now, let's see how to open a 1992 Toyota Camry with a fondue fork. The fondue fork is inserted underneath the forward opening under the rear door handle. This opening is exposed by raising the handle. We're inserting an inspection light in this instance so that we can see the linkage rod inside the door. With a little bit of practice, this is not necessary. Once we raise the handle, we insert the fondue fork into the door, hooking onto the lower linkage rod. The handle must be lowered in order to unlock the car. With the handle raised and a light inside the door, we can clearly see the linkage rod which lies just beyond the opening in the handle. There are actually two linkage rods here. We want the lower of the two linkage rods. Inside the door, we can see that the fondue fork hooks the lower linkage rod and pushes it to the rear to unlock the car. Let's see the entire operation again, but this time we'll open the car strictly by feel without a light in the door. It's very easy to locate the rod by feel. Remember, you're looking for the lower of two rods. Let the handle down, push to the rear, and the car is open. Now let's see how to open the front door of the same car. We'll be using the Clearview tool from AAA Products in conjunction with the TechTrain 1008 and the 1510 inspection light. All of these tools are covered in the quick reference guide which was included with your tape. We'll be locating the inside lock control linkage rod by feel with the short end of the tool. The handle linkage rod is clearly visible inside the door. Once the tool is inside the door, we will slide it to the inboard side of the handle linkage rod. Then pull up until we feel the tip of the tool lock onto the inside lock control linkage rod. Twisting the tool to bind the rod, we then push downward on the rod and unlock the door. Inside the door, we can see the horizontal handle linkage rod that we slide to the inside of. Pulling up will lock the tool onto the lock control linkage, pull down, and the door will be unlocked. Now that we know how to unlock the car, let's see how to remove the passenger side door lock from the door. The passenger side door lock is the only lock on the car which has the code number stamped on it, so this is the logical lock to remove if you're making a key to the car. The door panel is disassembled much like most other Toyotas with the exception of the inside door handle, which is more like a Lexus handle. The triangular piece of trim at the forward corner of the door is removed easily by pulling with your fingers. There are 3 snap-in connectors on the back of the trim. There are 2 Phillips head screws located at the forward edge of the door. Each screw is concealed by a snap-on plastic cap. Pry these caps off with your fingers and then you can remove the screws. The escutcheon around the inside handle is very much like that found on the Lexus LS 400. Using a clip removing tool, pry gently out on the top edge of the escutcheon. Once this is free, insert a small screwdriver below the handle and push downward on the escutcheon. This will free the escutcheon from the 2 pins that hold it in place. Then slide it outward and toward the rear of the car. There is a hook located underneath the forward edge of the escutcheon that locks into an opening inside the door. The handle and the inside lock control are attached to the door itself. They are not removed when we remove the door panel. There is a plastic plug located inside a hole under the forward edge of the armrest. This will reveal one of the 3 screws which holds the armrest assembly in place. A second screw is located in an opening below the center of the armrest, and a third screw is concealed behind the courtesy light. There is an additional Phillips head screw at the forward edge of the door pocket. This is concealed by a small plastic plug. The courtesy light is removed by first removing the lens. Pry carefully along the upper edge of the lens until it pops free. Then push downward on the entire lens and it will come off. The courtesy light itself is held into the door panel by a sheet metal spring at the back of the light. Carefully pry with a small screwdriver until you can reach this spring. Once the spring has been depressed, the courtesy light will come out quite easily. Then the wires can be disconnected from the courtesy light itself. The third screw holding the armrest onto the door can be reached through the opening left behind by removing the courtesy light. There are 2 plastic clips located along the rear edge of the door panel. These clips act very much like expansion bolts. When you push inward on the central portion of the clip, it releases the pressure on the clip and it can easily be removed. Once removed, the central portion can be pushed back into its original position and the clip can be reused. Now we're ready to remove the panel itself. Pull outward along the bottom edge of the door, releasing the clips, and then push up until the door panel is released from the door. If the car has power windows and power door locks, we will have to disconnect the 2 plugs located at the inside of the panel. Each plug is held in place by a small plastic tab. Pushing downward on the tab will release the plug from its socket. No prying is necessary. Once the plugs have been disconnected, we can remove the door panel completely. The plastic moisture barrier is held in place by a layer of black adhesive. Carefully pry the adhesive loose from the door panel itself. You only need to peel back the top right-hand corner of the moisture barrier. Inside the door you can see the forward bolt which holds the handle onto the outer skin of the door. There are 2 of these bolts. Both of them are 10 millimeters. The forward one can be easily reached through the opening we made by peeling back the moisture barrier. The screw at the rear of the handle can be reached by removing this black plastic cover over an opening in the inner part of the door. Once the cover has been removed, we can see the bolt quite clearly through the opening. With the cover removed, we can now release the bolt at the rear edge of the handle using a 10 millimeter socket on a long extension. Be careful not to drop the bolt down inside the door. It could be somewhat tricky to retrieve. You can insert your hand through the opening as a safety measure to prevent dropping the bolt. We're now ready to remove the handle from the door itself. Pull upwards on the bottom edge of the handle and then work the operators out from underneath the upper lip of the opening. This is as far as you need to go if you're just making a key to the car. You can now read the code number off the side of the lock. However, if you're servicing the lock, you will need to remove the handle completely. Begin by disconnecting the handle linkage first and then the lock linkage. Both of the linkage rods are connected by plastic clips which lock onto the rods themselves. Prying the clip free of the rod will then release the linkage rod from the clip. Once the handle is out of the way, we can see the elaborate plastic guards which protect the linkages inside the door. There is no danger of losing the linkages inside the door as the guards hold them in place. Once the handle is out of the car, we can now remove the lock quite easily. The lock is held into the handle itself by another 10mm bolt. Notice that the bolt that held the rear of the handle in place also secures the door lock, so the lock cannot be removed until the handle has been disconnected from the door. After the bolt has been released, the lock will lift free of the handle. The code number is stamped on the side of the lock that is visible from the rear of the car. It is not necessary to remove the handle completely in order to read the code number. Here you can see the code number stamped on the side of the lock. We'll cover the disassembly and service of this lock in the lock service section. Now let's go on to removing the trunk lock from the car. The trunk lock is located behind the lighted panel which is attached to the trunk lid itself. This is a portion of the tail light. The trunk key is inserted through an opening in the tail light lens into the trunk lock. You must remove this entire lighted panel before you can remove the trunk lock. The tail light assembly is secured to the back of the trunk lid with 9 nuts. Each one of the nuts goes over a long threaded shaft like this one. You will need to use either a deep well socket or a nut driver which has a hollow shaft. In this case, I'm using a 5/16 nut driver with a hollow shaft in order to remove the nuts. Only the bottom end of the shaft is threaded. The rest of the shaft is smooth. The nuts located at the bottom corners of the trunk lid are hidden behind rubber plugs. The shafts on these nuts are somewhat shorter than the others. 2 more nuts, as well as the electrical connections for the taillights themselves, are hidden behind these plastic covers. Lift up on the base of the cover and swing it to the side in order to gain access to the nuts and the plugs. The electrical connectors are very similar to those inside the door. There is a small plastic tab which must be depressed before the 2 portions of the connector can be separated. No prying is necessary. After all 9 of the nuts have been removed and the 2 electrical connectors have been disconnected, we can pull the taillight lens away from the back of the trunk lid. Once it has been removed, put it in a safe place. You do not want the lens to become scratched or cracked. There is another fastener located at the lower center of the taillight lens itself. This is a plastic plug-in connector just like those found on door panels. This connector plugs into a socket located in the back of the trunk lid itself. Now we're ready to remove the trunk lock itself. The lock is held into the trunk lid by a sheet metal clip similar to those found on many door locks. After the clip is out of the way, we can disconnect the linkage, which is attached to the lock pawl by a plastic clip just like those on the door lock linkage. Pushing up on the trunk lock will release it from the sheet metal, and then you can pull it free of the trunk lid. There is no code number stamped on the trunk lock. However, it is the only lock in the car that has all 9 tumblers. Once again, the disassembly and service of this lock will be covered in the lock service section. Now let's go on to removing the ignition lock from the car. Unlike other Toyotas, the ignition lock is mounted into the dashboard rather than on the steering column. Among other things, this means that we do not have to do anything with the steering wheel in order to remove the ignition lock, which is good because airbags are standard equipment on the 1992 Camry. There is a plastic cover around the ignition lock itself. This is very easily removed. You need no tools whatsoever. Pull up gently with your fingernails and the plastic cover will pop off. Then there is a lighted ring around the ignition lock. You'll need to remove this lighted ring before you can pull out the ignition lock itself. Grasp the lighted ring with your fingers and pry gently downwards on one of the 2 clips that hold the ring in place. Sometimes you'll have to pry on both clips. The retainer which holds the ignition cylinder into the ignition lock housing is located 2 inches back from the face of the lock cylinder and on the bottom edge of the lock. It is possible to reach this retainer with a piece of bent wire through the rectangular plug located directly below the ignition lock. However, you cannot see the retainer through this opening. You must know where it is and locate it by feel. For illustration purposes, we're going to remove the entire panel below the steering column so that we can show you the retainer. We have to remove the 2 plastic plugs and the housing around the fuse box before we can drop the panel. There are 2 screws holding a plastic housing around the fuse box. After removing these 2 screws, we can remove the plastic housing itself. After it has been removed, we can remove the screw which was hidden inside the opening at the top left-hand corner. This screw must be removed before the panel can be removed. There are 4 10mm bolts securing the panel in place. One is located behind each one of the plastic plugs, and 2 more are located at the lower right-hand corner and the lower left-hand corners of the panel. After all 4 of the bolts have been removed, we can pull down gently on the panel to release it from the dashboard. There are 2 sheet metal tabs located at the front of the panel that must disengage. With the panel out of the way, we can see the retainer located on the bottom of the ignition lock housing. Looking upwards toward the ignition lock housing, we can barely see the retainer at the forward edge. Turn the key to the accessory position and depress the retainer to remove the ignition lock. Replacing the ignition lock is the reverse of removing it. The key must be turned into the accessory position before you can slide it into the housing. Once the lock is seated, turning the key to the off position and removing it will lock it into place. Replacing the lighted ring around the ignition lock is very simple. As long as you remember which way the ring came off, it will only go back on in one position. Make sure that the 2 tabs on the ring properly engage with the spring clips that hold it in place. Do not force the escutcheon onto the ignition lock. There is a locating tab on the back of the escutcheon that must align with a slot in the dashboard. Once the tab is properly aligned, the escutcheon will seat easily. Once again, servicing the ignition lock cylinder will be covered in the lock servicing section. Now let's see how to remove a glove box lock. The glove box lock is held in place by 2 Phillips head screws located on the back side of the glove compartment door. After both of the screws have been removed, the glove compartment lock will slip downwards out of its slot in the top of the glove compartment door. Once the glove compartment lock is out, we're ready to service it.
To replace the glove compartment lock, slide the catch upwards into its socket, into the glove compartment door, and replace the 2 screws. After tightening both of the screws and checking the operation of the latch, the job will be complete. Now that we're familiar with how to remove and replace all of the locks on the car, let's see how to service a door lock. The first step in servicing the door lock is to remove the cam or lock pawl from the back of the lock, as well as the return spring. Then we'll need to remove the face cap of the lock. The lock pawl is attached to the plug by C-clip. A small screwdriver is used to pry the C-clip loose from the lock plug. Once the clip has been removed, the lock pawl will lift free, revealing the return spring. The lock pawl is spring-loaded in both directions because of an extension of the lock pawl which extends down between both ears of the spring. Prying carefully underneath one leg of the spring will release the spring from the lock housing. Be careful because it's possible to shoot the spring across the room at this point also. The face cap is staked into place in 2 positions directly opposite each other. Carefully pry with a sharp instrument underneath the face cap until you can release it. The face cap can be reused by restaking it in the same positions. Unlike some caps, this cap will only go on in one position because of a slot milled into the face cap that must match the lock housing. The shutter assembly on the front of the plug is attached to the plug. It will not come loose when you remove the face cap, so you don't have to worry about any parts flying out as you remove the face cap. Once the face cap has been removed, the plug of the lock will slide straight out. Make sure that you don't lose any of the tumblers as you pull it out. Here we have the lock plug removed from the lock housing. You can clearly see that the number 4 tumbler is split in 2. It is divided into 2 separate half tumblers. There is a spring on either side of the tumbler. The number 7 tumbler is identical, but it's not visible from this side of the plug. Here are all 4 of the different depth tumblers arranged from left to right, depths 1 through 4. Each one of the tumblers is marked, but you cannot see it in this view. Notice this portion of the tumbler here. This is the portion of the tumbler that rests against the key. The number 1 tumbler is the deepest depth. The number 4 tumbler is the shallowest depth. This is the reverse of most Toyota locks. Here we have a closer view of the number 1 and number 4 tumblers. Once again, the number 1 depth is the deepest cut and number 4 depth is the shallowest. This is the portion of the tumbler that comes into contact with the key blade. Only half of the width of the key blade rests against the tumbler at any one time. This V-notch is used to compress the spring. When the tip of the key enters the lock, the blade enters this V-notch in the tumbler, pushing the tumbler down against the pressure of its spring. As the lock becomes worn, this portion of the tumbler may bind against the key blank, causing a binding of the key as it goes in and out of the lock. Be especially careful of this in the trunk lock because of the angle that it is mounted at. Here is one of the split tumblers. A split tumbler will always be the same depth on both sides because both portions of the tumbler rest against the same portion of the key blade. This is where the key blade makes contact with the tumbler. Watch for wear on the split tumblers. As the lock becomes worn, the key may have a tendency to slide between the tumblers rather than to press the tumblers down, especially as the key is rotated. Also, watch for wear on the key blade itself. A worn key attempting to force itself between the tumblers could do severe damage to the lock. It's very important that the customer have worn keys replaced immediately. This is a lock service kit offered by Auto Security Products. This kit contains all of the components which are likely to become worn in these locks, and it also contains all of the parts that you would need for rekeying these locks. This kit was introduced in early 1992 and is available through all Auto Security Products dealers. Split tumblers are located only in the number 4 and 7 positions of the door, trunk, and ignition locks. All of the other tumblers are solid tumblers on these locks. The number 4 and 7 are the only positions having split tumblers in them. There are timing lugs located in the lock housing. When the core of the lock is properly inserted into the housing, it will only turn 180 degrees. The face cap of the lock will snap back onto the lock housing. Once it is in place, you can stake down the two portions that were staked before to hold it in place. You can use a flat-bladed screwdriver or a staking tool to stake the cover back into place. Unfortunately, these locks are rather hard to hold in the vise, so be careful that you don't accidentally crush the housing. After you have staked the face cap into position, check the operation of the key to make sure that the core of the lock does not bind against the face cap. Place the return spring back into its cavity at the back of the lock, putting one leg of the spring on one side of the housing lug and the other on the opposite side. You cannot put the spring in wrong. It will only fit in one position. After the spring is in place, bring the lock pawl into place and slide the extension down between the two legs of the spring. It will only seat onto the lock in one position. Once the lock pawl is in place, you can bring the C-clip back in and snap it into place. A pair of needle nose pliers can be very handy for snapping the clip back onto the post at the end of the plug. Check the operation of the key in the lock one more time to make sure that the lock pawl does not bind against the lock housing, and we're ready to replace the lock in the handle. The entire handle assembly is plastic. There are threaded metal inserts that the bolts screw into. Insert the lock into its socket and align the lugs over the threaded inserts. Insert the 10mm bolt into the rearmost opening and tighten, but do not over-tighten. Once the bolt is tight, the job is complete. Now let's see how to service another very similar lock. This is the Split-Tumbler trunk lock. The trunk lock is very similar in construction to the door lock, with the exception of the fact that it has all 9 tumblers and it is equipped with a lazy cam. The function of the lazy cam is to allow the inside trunk release to operate. In conjunction with this, the lock has 2 key pulls. The key can be pulled out in the horizontal position to override the inside trunk release. The lock pawl is held in place by a C-clip, the same as the lock pawl on the door lock. Once the C-clip has been removed, the lock pawl will lift off of the plug. There is no return spring on the trunk lock, however. Once again, the face cap is held in position by being staked on opposite sides of the lock housing. Careful prying with a sharp instrument will raise up the edges of the face cap, allowing you to remove it. Once the face cap comes off of the lock housing, we'll be able to slide the core of the lock out of the housing just as we did on the door lock. Once again, the shutter assembly is attached to the face of the plug, so you don't have to worry about the shutter assembly falling off as you remove the cap from the lock. Pry carefully around the cap because you will reuse this cap just as you did on the door lock. With the plug out of the housing, we can see that it is virtually identical to the door plug. The exception is that this one has a 9th tumbler in it, which is used for the valet key function. The split tumblers are in the number 4 and 7 position. The only real difference, other than the extra tumbler, is the small hole located at the back end of the plug. There is a spring in this hole, and a ball bearing rests on top of this spring. Be very careful that you don't lose the spring as you remove the plug from the housing. There is a timing lug located at the forward edge of the plug, which prevents the lock plug from rotating 360 degrees in the lock housing. Inside the lock housing or shell of the lock, you'll see that there are 4 slots for the tumblers. This is to allow for the second key pull. The key can be removed in either the vertical or the horizontal position. The lock core will fit into the lock in only one position, and it will rotate just less than 180 degrees. This is the vertical key pull position. If the key is turned to the left, it can be removed at the 90-degree position. However, it will not turn far enough to remove by turning it to the right. Only in the vertical and horizontal left positions can the key be removed. There is a lug cast into the housing of the lock that aligns the face cap in one position only. Once the face cap is back in place, it is staked into position just as we did on the door lock. The lock paw will only fit onto the lock in one position. You cannot put it on wrong. Slip the lock paw over the plug and then bring the C-clip back into place and snap it on. Test the operation of the lazy cam to make sure that it moves freely. Test the operation of the key once again, and we're ready to replace the trunk lock back into the car. Now that we're familiar with both the trunk and the door locks, let's see how to service the most difficult lock on this car, the ignition lock. On the outside, this lock looks very similar to other Toyota locks. However, its looks are deceiving. This lock is much larger than most Toyota locks, and the retainer is further back from the face of the lock. The cap over the face of the lock is held on in 3 places. There is 1 pin along the bottom of the lock, and there are 2 portions of the face cap that extend through the lock housing that are staked into place. Here you can see the pin and one of the staked places. We'll remove the pin by drilling a small hole right next to the pin and then prying the pin out with a very sharp ice pick. It sometimes helps to drill a small hole into the side of the pin itself so that the ice pick has a place to grab. Here's our same lock after we've drilled the hole next to the pin. I've inserted the ice pick into the hole and I'm pulling upwards now on the pin. Careful prying will work the pin up and out of the opening. Once the pin has come up far enough, we can grab it with our fingers or with a pair of tweezers. The 2 staked pins from the forward face of the lock that extend through from the back need to be driven through, but these are a part of the face of the lock. You could break the face before you could drive them through. So we're filing away a portion of the staked part of each pin to make it slightly smaller. Once we've filed it away, we will then drive the pins through with a punch, allowing the face of the lock to come off. A careful combination of prying around the edge and driving in the center of each pin will eventually work the face of the lock free of the lock housing. Patience is the key here. Do not try to rush. You will break something. Now that the pins have begun to come free, we can carefully pry just behind where we removed the pin. Carefully, we can remove the face of the lock. When it starts to come loose, at one point, work your way around the outside edge of the cap until the entire cap is free. Once the cap has come off of the lock cylinder, we can remove the lock core. Here is our face cap after we've removed it. As you can see, there is still plenty of metal left on the pins that were staked into place. We'll be able to stake them back into place again when we replace the cap. With the face cap off, we can now remove the true arc ring at the rear of the plug, which will allow the plug to slide out the front of the lock housing. Before the plug will slide out of the housing, you have to depress the tail end of the buzzer activator lever. Once this is pushed down, the plug will be free to slide out of the lock housing. The ignition lock contains exactly the same tumblers as the door lock. We have cuts numbers 1 through 8, and cuts numbers 4 and 7 have split tumblers in them. The number 9 tumbler is only contained in the trunk lock and the glove compartment lock, which we will see shortly. The dark square at the forward edge of the plug is the buzzer activator. This is pushed up by the tip of the key when the key is inserted into the lock. On the other side of the plug with the key inserted, we can see the gap between the two split tumblers in the number 4 position and the number 7 position. When you reassemble the ignition lock, you must once again depress the buzzer activating lever before inserting the plug into the lock. With the plug fully inserted into the lock, you can release the buzzer activator and remove the key. Now we can replace the true arc ring at the rear of the lock plug. Once the true arc ring is installed, it should turn freely around the plug. This is a loose fit. Now we're ready to replace the face cap onto the lock. The retainer and the pin that hold the face cap are on the same side of the lock. The slot in the rectangular cutout at the forward face of the lock housing is what the pin fits into. Slide the lock back onto the face cap, pushing it down until the 2 pins seat back through their holes in the flange at the front of the ignition lock. Light tapping on the lock housing will push it down over the ends of the pins. Once the housing has seated, we can bring in a staking tool and stake the 2 pins back into place. Next, start the pin back into its hole in the flange at the back side of the face cap. Using a drift punch, drive the pin in until it is flush with the top of the flange. This will hold the face cap back in place securely. Check the operation of the lock cylinder one more time before replacing the ignition lock back into the car. Remember, this lock has a push feature in order to remove the key. The spring is located in the lock housing, however, so you'll have to push on it with your finger. Now, let's go on to the simplest lock on the car, the glove compartment lock. The glove box lock contains 5 tumblers, cuts numbers 5 through 9. There is one important difference about this lock, however. The split tumbler is in the number 8 position. This is the only lock on the car that has a split tumbler in the number 8 position. From the back of the lock, we can see that the lock plug operates a lever which prevents the handle from pulling when it is in the locked position. You can also see the retainer that releases the plug from the lock housing. Before we can remove the plug from the lock, we must remove the plastic cover over the face of the lock. This is very easy to do. Simply pry around the top and the bottom edge of the cover until it pops free. Once the cover is off of the lock, we can then depress the retainer and pull outward on the lock plug. It does not have to be turned in order to be removed. Carefully slide the plug out, making sure that you don't lose any of the tumblers. With the plug out of the lock, we can see that we have 1 retainer and 5 tumblers. We have cuts numbers 5 through 9 represented in this lock. The number 9 tumbler is used only with the valet key, so you will only find the number 9 tumbler in the trunk and the glove compartment. However, in this one we have a split tumbler in the number 8 position. All of the other locks have split tumblers in the number 4 and 7 positions only. The easiest way to put the plug back into the lock is to use the key. With the key inserted, it will slide easily inside the housing after you depress the retainer. Once the plug has gone all the way into the housing, twist it slightly until the operator at the end of the plug engages with the lever. Another interesting feature of this lock is that we can look into the keyway easily and see the alignment of the V notches in the tumblers with the keyway. You can see how using a worn key or having worn tumblers would cause problems with the operation of this lock. Snapping the cover back onto the lock and testing the operation of the key completes the job. That also completes Toyota Split Tumbler locks. I hope you've enjoyed watching this video as much as I enjoyed making it. If you have any questions, comments, or suggestions, please contact us at this address: Tech Train Productions, Post Office Box 15401, Pensacola, Florida 32514. Or you can call our toll-free order line at 800-356-0136. Or you may fax us at area code 904-476-7410. Those of you outside the United States can reach us at area code 904-476-7197. Thank you for choosing Tech Train.